Let's get started. Wait, hold on one second. Sorry about that. All right.
Everybody mute.
So today's Torah portion is Ekev, and it begins in the middle of chapter 7. It actually seems like it kind of begins in the middle of something. But I would like to focus on the first few verses. It starts chapter 7, verse 12. I'm going to read these verses from verse 12 through verse 26, and this is what we're going to be focusing on, okay? And if you do obey these rules and observe them carefully, the Lord your God will maintain faithfully for you the covenant that he made on oath with your fathers. He will favor you and bless you and multiply you. He will bless the issue of your womb and the produce of your soil, your new grain and wine and oil, the calving of your herd and the lambing of your flock in the land that he swore to your fathers to assign to you. You shall be blessed above all other peoples. There shall be no sterile male or female among you or among your livestock. The Lord will ward off from you all sickness. He will not bring upon you any of the dreadful diseases of Egypt, about which you know, but will inflict upon them, excuse me, but will inflict them upon all your enemies. You shall destroy all the peoples that the Lord your God delivers to you, showing them no pity. And you shall not worship their gods, for that would be a snare to you. Should you say to yourselves, these nations are more numerous than we, how can we dispossess them? You need have no fear of them. You have but to bear in mind what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and all the Egyptians, the wondrous acts that you saw with your own eyes, the signs and the portents, the mighty hand and the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God liberated you. Thus will the Lord your God do to all the peoples you now fear. The Lord your God will also send a plague against them until those who are left in hiding perish before you. Do not stand in dread of them, for the Lord your God is in your midst, a great and awesome God. The Lord your God will dislodge those peoples before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them at once, else the wild beasts would multiply to harm you. The Lord your God will deliver them up to you, throwing them into utter panic until they are wiped out. He will deliver their kings into your hand, and you shall obliterate their name from under the heavens. No man shall stand up to you until you have wiped them out. You shall consign the images of their gods to the fire. You shall not covet the silver and gold on them and keep it for yourselves, lest you be ensnared thereby. For that is abhorrent to the Lord your God. You must not bring an abhorrent thing into your house, or you will be prescribed like it. You must reject it as abominable and abhorrent, for it is prescribed. Okay, now what I want to do is really go in order here, and there's a very interesting structure and order to this little section here that I think tells us a great deal. So first of all, the beginning tells us if indeed the nation obeys the commandments, God will keep his covenant. We have here the word covenant, and that's very important because it refers here to the covenant that was first promised to our forefathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. At this point in time, there has been one covenant between God and the nation, and that is the covenant at Sinai. We are before the final covenant that is going to be mentioned at the end of Deuteronomy, but that will actually be executed in the land of Israel under the book of Joshua. Excuse me, I did not silence my phone. Okay. So that's the beginning. And then what we see is the wonderful blessings that will come to the nation as a result of keeping God's commandments. Now, at the beginning, verse 13, we see things having to do with agriculture, things that having to do with prosperity. And it refers to the land, but not just any land. You're not just going to be wealthy, but you will have prosperity on the land that God promised to your forefathers, okay? So this actually is very important because it connects to the covenant. From the very beginning, God's covenant with the forefathers, as in addition to God's covenant with the nation, which we are in that time right here and now, has always been about the land. Okay, God promises the land. He promises prosperity in the land, and if there will be a breach of covenant, then they will be thrown out of the land. So from the beginning, this idea of the covenant is tied up with the land. Then we have the next step, verse 14 and 15. And here we have not just prosperity, but relative blessing. In other words, we will be blessed more than the other nations. And we have then fertility, which of course is very important for blessing. If we are going to be fruitful and multiply, then we have to have fertility. And at the same time, we have a reference to other nations in this remembrance of Egypt. And in verse 15, it's a very interesting mention. It says that we, the nation of Israel, will not suffer any of the diseases of Egypt, which we saw how God had done that. Now, what are those illnesses or plagues of Egypt? It's the 10 plagues, or some of them at least, these horrible afflictions that were put onto Egypt. And so God here is saying that we will not have any illness, but particularly not the plagues that God put in Egypt. And what does he say instead? He says that instead of us having these illnesses, God will place those illnesses on our enemies. So in a way, we have this comparison. Egypt is our enemy. And the same way that God placed the plagues, struck Egypt with plagues, he will strike our enemies with similar plagues. We, as a nation of Israel, will be protected by that. And of course, this is all dependent on us obeying God's commandments, as we see in verse 12. Okay, now in the following, we have a more specific, starting with verse 16, we have a more specific reference to coming into the land. And in verse 16, it begins by talking about what things that we have to remember, things, a very important instruction that we have to remember as we're about to go and encounter. So first of all, it says we should show them no pity. Okay. Next thing, we should not worship their gods. And we also have we should not fear them. And finally, we have in verse, we talked this already, that, we have to remember, we have to remember this is in verse 6, in verse 18, we need to remember what God did to Pharaoh, which of course links us back to verse 15, where we talk about how the plagues of Pharaoh are not going to be on us. So there's this underlying comparison going on here between what will happen to the nations, like what happened to Pharaoh and Egypt, as opposed to what will happen to us. We have the blessing. We are going to come into the land. We will have the reward. Our enemies who come up against us, they will suffer the fate of Egypt. And of course, this is a very effective way to explain this to the nation, because this is the nation who experienced Egypt. So they know, they can appreciate what it is that God is trying to tell us. Now, again, we have one thing I find very interesting in verse 20, that God says, in the English, it says a plague, but the Hebrew word in verse 20 is tzir'ah. And tzir'ah is thought to be some kind of horrible bug, mosquito, something like that. So it's not just a plague, but there's some kind of special something, some kind of special bug that is dangerous. I know we could think of ourselves of, dangerous mosquitoes that carry very highly infectious and fatal diseases. And this is something that also God says he is going to send against our enemies. And at the end, of course, God also reminds us again in verse 21 not to fear. So this whole section, on the one hand, gives encouragement to the nation that God will be with them as they enter the land, and they will, it's important that they not take pity on the enemy. They have to respond effectively and defeat the enemy, not to fear them, but at the same time knowing that God is on their side and God will help them in defeating them. Now, we had one little reference here in verse 16 to something that is going to be then continued afterwards. In verse 16, it says, you will destroy the peoples, you should not take pity on them. And then we have this other half sentence. You shall not worship their gods, for that would be a snare to you, a snare or a trap. Okay, the word in Hebrew is mokesh. Now, this idea of the nations being a trap is referred to twice in this section, and it's very similar to other things that are referred to. And we're going to see how that plays out in other places. But what we're seeing here is in verse, and it comes back to this idea in verse 25 and 26, the importance of getting rid of the pagan worship, of the idolatry. And God says here, you have to burn them, you have to get rid of them. Why? Again, in verse 25, they will become a snare to you. Okay? And there's this idea that, you know, there's a terrible risk. You come into the land, you have to defeat these enemies. Not only defeat them, but you've got to get rid of them, and you've got to get rid of their gods. The fear here is that they will become a very dangerous influence on the nation, that they will woo them into the pagan worship. Now, we know that this is exactly what happened. And it happened almost from the beginning of the entry of the nation into the land. It got particularly bad during the time of the Judges, which is the book of Judges spans about 400 years. So that's pretty bad. And then later on, particularly after the division of the kingdom and the division into the northern and southern kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was full of idol and pagan worship. There was the occasional king that got rid of it, but most of them were really, really full of pagan worship. So this is not an idol fear. This is something very, very important. But now let's take a look at verse 22, because here we have something that kind of tempers what we've said until now. Until now, we've talked about how important it is. They come in, they got to defeat the nation, get rid of them, and get rid of the idol worship. And then we have in verse 22 that they need to dislodge these nations, okay? That God will dislodge these nations little by little. Well, that seems to fly in the face of the urgency that Moses is telling them. If it's little by little, you are keeping these nations amongst you for quite some time, and then you can end up with this snare, with this evil influence. Why does it say little by little? So that there will not be this abundance of wild animals. Now, if we think about this practically, it makes perfect sense. If you go into another country, a country that has been inhabited, cities that have been built, there is commerce, there is trade, there is systems, governing systems, there's civilization, in short, okay? There is an existing country with nations and civilization. If you go in and destroy it completely and then have to rebuild it, even if you don't destroy the houses, let's say you keep the houses and you move into them, okay? But when you conquer it all at once, it can take time for you to actually settle each of these places. It's going to take time to take over the governing systems. If you do this all at once, and I think here it's not just about wild animals, there's no question. If you leave vast areas that had been settled previously unsettled because you haven't gotten around to settling it yet, okay? You're busy fighting, and it's about 10 years until you're going to end up settling a particular area. Meanwhile, you emptied it, no question. You're going to have wild animals coming into that area. And then when you come and you want to settle it, it's going to be very, very difficult. But I'm wondering if this isn't also just a symbol of the problem with destroying everything and starting again. You want to destroy the pagan culture and the pagan worship, but if you destroy everything and you have to start again, in a way you're saying you're destroying civilization in order to rebuild civilization. Now, there's parts of civilization you want to destroy. But this seems to be a very practical temperance of the whole atmosphere of this section, because it's saying as much as I'm asking you to be eager to destroy to get rid of the other nations and destroy their pagan worship. I'm saying you have to do this slowly, otherwise you are going to be in trouble, because you can't destroy too much before you're ready to replace it with something else. You cannot leave a vacuum that might be filled with animals, or a vacuum that might be filled with anarchy. In either case, you cannot leave this vacuum. And I think that this is very interesting because, and there are many people who have questioned this, finding a contradiction. What does it mean? How can you say on the one hand, God says, well, slowly, slowly, and on the other hand says, get rid of all these pagan nations, do it quickly. Some people have used that to even say, oh, there's a contradiction here, different authors, that kind of thing. I don't think they're different authors. I think this is presenting two different challenges that the nation of Israel are facing as they go into the land. And what Scripture is telling us here is the need to balance. And no solution is going to be perfect, because totally solving one challenge is going to get you into bigger trouble on the other challenge. And so somehow you've got to work out a system. And it seems to me then, this constant use of the snare, okay? God is saying, again, actually this is Moses saying, we have the use of the snare twice here. We have in verse 16, it says, do not worship their gods, because it will be a snare for you. Clearly, pagan worship itself is a snare. And then it says afterwards, in verse 25, where it's telling you to actively destroy the various pagan gods, again, so that it won't ensnare you. Now, what I wanted to look at, we've had similar words, slightly different, but the same idea. We've seen it expressed already in the book of Numbers, and we're going to see it continuing onward. And I wanted to take a look at some of that and see what we can learn from it. So first of all, in the book of Numbers, in chapter 33, verses 51 to 55. Okay, so here, this is God speaking in this place, and he's saying to Moses what he needs to tell to the nation of Israel. This is spoken just right before the book of Deuteronomy. It's more or less the same time. Okay, and God is saying to Moses what you need to say to the nation of Israel. Speak to the Israelite people, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. You shall destroy all of their figured objects. You should destroy all their molten images, and you shall demolish all of their cult places. And you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land to you to possess. You shall apportion the land among yourselves by lot. Okay, we can skip that thing. But in verse 55, but if you do not dispossess the inhabitants of the land, those whom you allow to remain shall be stings in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they will harass you in the land in which you live, so that I will do to you what I plan to do to them. Here we have the very same idea, but here it's not referring to the actual idols as to the people, but they actually go together. It's very clear that that is the context. God is saying to them, you've got to conquer the land, you've got to get rid of all of the idols, and you have to get rid of the people, because if you leave them there with their idols, they will then become a sting in your eye and a thorn in your side. I think it's a very similar idea. They're a snare, they're a pain in the neck, and I don't think here it's referring to a security defense issue. It's referring to the same kind of negative influence that God is very concerned about. If this pagan worship and their culture remains in the land, this is going to cause you problems. Now, if we move on to what actually happens when they enter the land of Israel, let's look first to the book of Joshua. They enter the land and they've conquered the land. Now, keep in mind, the book of Joshua lives about 28 years, or shall we say the book of Joshua spans about 28 years. He's 80 something years old when 82, I think, when he enters the land of Israel. and he is 110 when he dies. Okay, so in Joshua 23, verse 5. Now, in Joshua 23, first of all, what we learn in Joshua until now, they have a lot of conquests, big conquests, smaller conquests. There's a point at which Joshua lists all the places that are still left to conquer. He then divides the land among the tribes, essentially saying to them, okay, go, take possession of your land, complete the conquest, each tribe in their own place. But we do know that at the end of the book of Joshua, they haven't completed conquering everything. And of course, we see that even more clearly at the beginning of the book of Judges, where we have an exact list of, at that point, what is left. But if we look at chapter 23, again, here, this is Joshua at the end of his days, and he's giving a talk to the nation. And what is he saying? Verse 5, the Lord your God himself will thrust them out on your account and drive them out to make way for you, and you shall possess their land as the Lord your God has promised you. He is encouraging the nation to continue the battle. And very similar to what Moses is saying to the nation here, don't be afraid, because if you take the battle and fight the battle, God will be with you. But be most resolute to observe faithfully all that is written in the book of the teaching of Moses, without ever deviating from it right or to left, and without intermingling with those nations that are left among you. Do not utter the names of their gods or swear by them. Do not serve them or bow down to them, but hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. Okay, so it's very, very important. He's telling them they have to get rid of these nations, and in the process, don't stick to them. Don't mingle with them. Don't intermarry with them. Okay, and then he reminds them in verse 9 that God has done so much for them. He's already helped them chase out so many of the nations. And then in verse 12, for should you turn away and attach yourself to the remnants of those nations, to those that are left among you, and intermarry with them, you are joining them and they joining you. Know for certain that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out before you. They shall become a snare and a trap. Okay, here we have the exact same word that we have in Deuteronomy, mokesh, a snare or a trap. It's really the same thing. But it continues to pull out the language that we have in Numbers. A scourge to your sides and thorns in your eyes. In the Hebrew, it's almost the exact same words. Until you perish from this good land that the Lord your God has given you. So here we have this idea that there is an understanding that the nations are still there, their gods are still there. Joshua is not saying, he's not criticizing them. He's not saying, oh, why haven't you done till now? It's been 28 years. They've done a lot, but he is telling them, you better keep doing it. And so basically what you're seeing here is a situation that this war is taking a long time. It's not over quickly. It is that little by little, exactly as Moses had warned them in Deuteronomy, but they have to constantly be on guard. And if they connect to the peoples that are left amongst them, instead of working to drive them out, they will stop getting God's assistance in conquering the entire land. Now, finally, we see in the book of Judges, in chapter 2, and here we have criticism, okay? Now, it's interesting because Joshua, as I said, that whole book is 28 years, and that chapter 23, he says towards the end of his life, maybe not at the very end of his life, but towards the end of his life, it says he's already old when he makes those comments. But in Judges chapter 2, which is going to be right after that, it's right after Joshua's death, we have an angel of God coming, and that angel of God clearly rebukes the nation, okay? And he says as follows. I brought you up from Egypt, and I took you into the land which I had promised an oath to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you, for your part, must make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You must tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. Look what you have done. Therefore, I have resolved not to drive them out before you. They shall become your oppressors, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Again, the same Hebrew word, mokesh. What we're seeing then is something, okay, maybe Joshua had too much patience. Maybe Joshua felt that the little by little could continue. But clearly, after Joshua's death and the beginning of Judges, God sends an angel, his own messenger, who says in his own words very clearly, you've reached a breaking point here. You connected yourselves. You didn't do what Joshua said. You didn't separate yourself and continue the battle. Clearly, what happens at this point, after Joshua's death, maybe a few years later, maybe already at the very end of Joshua's life, the nation becomes lazy. They stop the battle. They're not continuing to move forward. And even more than that, they not only leave the nations there, but they are starting to connect to them. They're influenced by them. And we see that throughout the book of Judges, that we have the nations becoming involved in idol worship, connecting to the land. And what happens? God says, exactly, you're going to connect to the nations. I'm going to remove my assistance from you. You will be oppressed. And of course, that becomes the whole book of Judges. So if I look at this whole story together, and I'm trying to reconcile these two ideas, the urgency to enter the land, conquer the whole thing, and get rid of the idol worship so we do not have the snare. And yet at the same time, this idea of they have to do it slowly so as not to, ruin everything, not to destroy civilization before you're able to replace it with a civilization. I think that what we're hearing here is a balance, and a balance that requires not just a balance we sit down and we say, can we do a little bit of this, a little bit of that? A balance that requires ongoing vigilance, because what God is saying here is two things. Not just there's not just get rid of them so they won't be a snare, but while they're still in the land, don't connect to them. So there's an awareness that there's a process. You're going to get rid of them as many as you can, as quickly as you can, but there will continue to be some that are amongst you who haven't yet gotten rid of the people, the idol worship, etc. You have to constantly be vigilant not to connect to them, because for as long as they are in your land, they are a snare. I think, whereas in our verses, that we're coming back to our verses in Deuteronomy, where we have this comparison between the plagues against Egypt and the kind of assistance that God will be giving the nation as they enter the land. I think the message there is one of encouragement. Don't worry, God is with you. But by the same token, I think it's very clear that we're not just talking about, there is no more plagues of Egypt, okay? The nature of God's salvation, once they enter the land, is not going to be this miraculous pull you out of Egypt in one fair stroke after 10 tribes and 10 plagues, and split the Red Sea, and this miraculous, go from slavery to freedom in 24 hours. They're going to come into the land, and it will be a process. If they are going to achieve true liberty, autonomy, independence, control over the land of Israel, and enabling that control, meaning the entire nation is worshiping the God of Israel, not pagans, divorcing themselves from the negative influences. It is a process. Finished are the days of the miracles. The miracles will be there in small doses. The miracles will be there to assist the nation who then has to fight. We see that, by the way, in the book of Joshua. One of the most interesting things about the book of Joshua is to follow the process from a miraculous battle like Jericho as it goes through to the last battles, where the miracles take up less space and the physical realities take up greater spaces. And that's how it's supposed to be. God is not turning away from Israel. God is saying, it's time for you to take responsibility. You have to fight the battles. You have to do this. I'll help you, but you've got to take the first step. And I think this says a great deal about the complexity of what is required from a nation when they come into the land and take over. It's not going to be poof. We have to remember that as we're fighting for this land, we also have to, at the same time, be constantly vigilant not to allow negative influences that will take us away from God, influences will take us away from the values and the commandments that we are obligated to. We've got to keep constantly vigilant and gradually get rid of the influences that are dangerous, gradually pull ourselves to a position where it's all the nation in the land of Israel with God at the helm. I think there's a lot that this can teach us about the challenges that face the modern state of Israel. Okay, we're not getting rid of idols. Okay, but the it has been a long journey to achieve sovereignty in this area, and we are not finished. And I think what we do see here is that we have to be patient, we have to do it gradually, but we have to always keep track of the goal. And don't let other influences lead us astray from what is our mission and what is our goal. So that's all I have today, but I'd love to hear comments if any of you would like to say anything or ask any questions.
So,
yes, Vanessa.
Given what you just said there about the patience and the vigilance and all of that, how positively, how hopefully can we see the government that is in control in Israel right now? Is it part of that slower process that will accomplish something good? Or is it the snare?
I don't think, well, let's put it this way. I don't think that we have a snare here.
Okay.
It's also, it's a big difference when you're dealing between Israel and its enemies and conflicts within Israel. But there's no question, one of the challenges that we face here in Israel is facing people who are dealing with people within our own nation who are not necessarily confident enough or convinced enough to understand how valid our claim is to the land.
Yep,
to the
exactly,
whole land.
Right.
And so
right.
that becomes part of the conversation.
Yep.
But today, excuse me, one of the things that we've dealt with today is we are after 2,000 years of being surrounded by snares. You know, we have not entered the land of Israel out of this desert where we're shielded by these pillars of fire and the clouds of glory and like no one has touched us for 40 years. You know, it's a whole different situation. But the challenges are similar. There's no question. And you can't destroy it all. If you destroy it all at once, you will get anarchy and you will get wild animals. On the other hand, you've got to figure out the way. Now, this new government, I don't know, time will tell. Will the people with the right ideas have the ability to influence the others? It's very possible, but it's too early to tell.
That's what we hope.
Yes. But Vanessa, you had a question.
Yes, please. I'm suggesting, in order to keep this pertinent and relevant to today, that the worshiping of idols may not be just a tangible thing. In our lives today, I suggest that we are chasing after money, or we're chasing after self-interest, self-improvement. They have superseded. For instance, we can't get people in shul when there was shul on Shabbos. They were going to the club. They were, playing tennis. They were doing something. So I guess we just still have not seemed to avoid these issues that we have today.
100%, Vanessa. I really think that what you really hit it on the head. And when we see today, I'll tell you where this is also where I'm thinking along some of these lines. Today, you hear very often, I just read, this is a perfect example, I think, the whole Ben and Jerry's thing, okay, mm-hmm. The ice cream thing.
Yes.
What makes the Ben and Jerry's thing complicated in some ways, so the original Ben and Jerry, okay, just a day or two ago, wrote an article that I saw in the New York Times, okay, where they talk about that they are Jews, they love Israel, they're proud Jews, and what they're doing is not anti-Semitic and it's not anti-Israel, but they feel very strongly that Israel is persecuting the Arabs. They are illegally occupying land that is not theirs, and therefore they are doing this in order to express their opinion against Israeli policy. Okay, now anybody who knows the history of Israel, now, believe me, I think that we have to make sure that the Palestinians are treated as fairly as possible, but we're in a very difficult security situation. So some of the security measures are there because any one of these people could easily be a terrorist, and it's a terrible, terrible situation.
Yes.
But I want to separate that for a second. Don't tell me this is occupied territory. And if you're a Jew who is really and truly understanding of your Jewish heritage and has read the Bible and understands what the vision and the mission should be. Now, I am not advocating walk into Judea and Samaria and throw out all the Arabs. Not at all.
No.
Not at all. But I am definitely walking into Judea and Samaria and saying it's mine. And I'm going to keep moving in that direction, whatever it is I have to do to gain additional control, little by little, dealing with the various challenges I had. The
Amen.
negative influences, the snares that I see, is what they call civil rights and political rights and all these wonderful, and I believe in political rights and civil rights, and every human being needs to be treated with dignity.
Yes.
But these have become snares. These have become ideas that have taken us away from how we're supposed to look at things. It has skewed our vision. And that to me is following in what you were saying, Vanessa. I think this is part of, if we look at it today in today's context.
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
I totally agree with you.
Okay. Good. Okay. Does anybody else have something else that they want to comment or say? Okay. Well, this was a great visit. Thanks so much. See you again next week.
Thank you, Sondra.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Shalom.
Good word.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.